Alright, so I'm going to be doing some videos that are just review topics of things that you've probably seen before, but just to kind of reinforce what you already know, maybe give you some new strategies to make sure that you're really comfortable with topics that you probably learned in algebra, so that you can use these tools for the new material that we'll be covering this year without it being a stumbling block. So even if you already feel confident with things like adding and subtracting positive and negative numbers, which is what we are starting with, I really encourage you to kind of come along with me on the journey and try to make sure that you really understand this method so that you can use it when you need to, whenever something gets confusing, even if you feel like most of the time you're pretty confident with it. Okay, so one way to handle adding and subtracting integers like this is by thinking of each number in the problem as belonging to a team, either the positive team or the negative team. So before you sort of start adding things together, you're going to decide which team each number or term belongs to, and then that makes it much easier to sort of add things up and see how they balance out. So over here I'll be making notes about what kinds of numbers belong on each team. And this first example here, we don't have any subtraction, we are just adding numbers together. So we have some of these numbers are positive and some of them are negative. And so on the positive team, of course we have, anytime we have plus a positive number, or of course if it starts with a positive number, that belongs to the positive team. And it should make sense that when we are adding these numbers together, if the number is negative, it belongs to the negative team. So on the negative side, anytime we have plus with a negative number, like this plus -6 here, that belongs to the negative team. And this problem starts with a positive number, but of course if it started with a negative number like this one does, that would also count towards the negative team. And as you'll be able to see, we will be able to rewrite some of these other situations to match this type of problem. But you can also learn some more rules to help you decide on the teams a little bit faster and without getting confused. So let's see how these points actually add up. So for the positive team, I've got 3 and 5 and 1. So I'm going to make a little scoreboard here with the points for the positive team on one side and the points for the negative team on the other side. There won't always be this many different numbers, but even if you only have 2 numbers, this method still works. And you won't have to write it out every time, but it's a useful tool to have if you ever do get confused with the signs of different numbers. So on the positive side, I have 3 and 5 and 1. So I'm just going to write each of these as points for the positive team. And on the negative side, I have -6 and -7. So I'm just going to write 6 and 7 on the negative side here. I could write it with the negative signs, but I already know that they're negative because they're on the negative team's points. So now what I'm going to do is add up the points for each team and decide the winner. So for the positive side, 3 plus 5 is 8, plus 1 makes a total of 9 points. And on the negative side, 6 plus 7 is 13. So the final score is 9 to 13. And then we want to ask the question, who won? And the key here is by how much? So we can see here that the negative team won in this example by 4 points. That means the answer is -4. Of course, you could type this in a calculator, but number one, you might make a mistake when you're typing something this long. And number two, sometimes things have variables and stuff, and this same strategy will work for things that have variables that you can't necessarily just type in your calculator. But you could check this on a calculator if you wanted to. Okay, so hopefully it makes sense. We decide each number, what team does that belong to, and then we figure out who won and by how much, and that's going to be our answer. The next couple examples just have 2 numbers, but it's not always going to be the case that there's one number for each side. They could be both on the same side. The other new thing we have to deal with here is subtraction. And here, everything has been added together, so we only needed to ask ourselves, is this a positive number or a negative number? But here, you could think about this as subtracting a +4. So technically there are no negative numbers in this problem, but hopefully it makes sense. We should end up with 2. This 4 definitely should belong to the negative team. So we have something that counts for the negative team when we add a negative number, but we also have something for the negative team anytime we subtract a positive number. And we could actually rewrite this problem to see this parallel as 6 plus -4. So you can always turn subtraction into plus and then change the sign of what comes after it. You don't need to write this out like this every time, especially for something as easy as 6 minus 4. Hopefully you just know right away that that's 2. But we're going to see a little later how this rule applies to slightly trickier problems. We can change subtraction to addition, and then that changes the sign of what comes after. So subtracting a +4 is the same as adding -4. So of course, either way you want to think about it, this scoreboard comes out like this, where we have 6 points for the positive team, 4 points for the negative team, and we can tell that positive wins by 2. So of course the answer, as we expect, is +2. You wouldn't need to use this method for a question this easy, but it's helpful to see how the method works on a problem that you are already comfortable with. Okay. Now let's see how this rule applies to something like this. So once again, we have subtracting a positive number, and we could change this into adding a negative number if you want to. You don't need to. Either way, you should recognize that both of these numbers belong to the negative team. This is just a negative number that we're starting with. And here we are subtracting a positive number, or we're adding a negative number. Either way you want to think about it, both of these are points for the negative team. So now, if I want to think about who won and by how much, well, the positive team didn't score any points, and the negative team scored a total of 6. So the answer is going to be -6. The negative team won by 6 points because both of these numbers contributed towards the negative side. Okay, now we have an example where we are subtracting a negative number. So if you want to, we can apply this rule, change subtraction to addition, and that changes the sign of what comes after. So this subtraction we can change to addition, and that means that this becomes a +2. So this just becomes 3 + 2, which of course equals 5. If you wanted to draw out the chart, you could, just to be totally thorough. These both count towards the positive team. In this case, the negative team didn't score anything, so of course the answer is a +5. But the lesson here is that when we subtract a negative number, that number ends up counting for the positive team. So you could rewrite it like this, or you could just know that rule and recognize when you see 3 minus -2 that that's actually going to end up being 2 points for the positive team. Okay? Now we have a slightly more complicated example, and this is something that I see people making mistakes on a fair amount, and that is just sort of forgetting about the parentheses. But if we want to handle subtraction, a good way to do it is to change it to addition and then change the sign of what comes after it. So I'm going to rewrite this problem, -2. Instead of the minus, I'm going to write plus, and then I need to change the sign of everything in this set of parentheses, because subtraction changes the sign of what comes after it in both directions. It can change a negative to a positive, and it can change a positive to a negative. So I need to change the sign of both of these numbers. So this is going to become plus a -6, and then I could write this as minus a -8. So I kept this minus, but this 8 turned into a -8 because I had a +6 minus a +8, but I was subtracting. So that turned into a -6 minus a -8 to get rid of this subtraction and turn it into addition. Or you could also skip this step and recognize that this is going to become +8, so it's -2 plus a -6 plus a +8. Okay, so hopefully this made sense. You might have learned a different method for dealing with a minus sign in front of parentheses. If you want to draw it distributing like this, that also totally works. But it can get a little confusing when you have subtraction here and subtraction here. So just make sure you're pretty careful. This 8 would belong to, if there was nothing else here, this 8 would belong to the negative team. And because of this minus sign on the outside, it ends up belonging to the positive team at the end. Okay. So let's add these up for the positive team, we have 8 points. And for the negative team, we have 2 points and then 6 points. So if we add this up, 8 to 8, the answer is a tie, which means that the difference between the points is 0. Nobody won by anything. So the answer is 0. So if you get a tie, the answer is 0. Okay, so hopefully this helped you recognize which teams different numbers belong to. I think it's an easy way to kind of figure out what to do, especially when you get confused with negative numbers versus subtraction. Why don't we do one more example? Let's do something that has kind of a mix of these different things that we've seen. So let's do an example F. That's like 2 minus 6 plus negative 3 minus negative 5 plus 1. Okay, so let's try to figure out which team each of these things belongs to, and then we can add up the score. And if we were ignoring everything outside the parentheses, then this one would belong to the negative team, and this one would belong to the positive team. Right? We have a negative number and a positive number. This subtraction is going to change both of these signs. So I'm going to rewrite this. 2 minus 6 plus negative 3. This negative 5 is going to become plus 5. This positive 1 is going to become negative 1. So this subtraction changed the teams of both of these numbers. Okay, now I can kind of go through and figure out where each number fits. So positive, negative. Okay, positive numbers, I've got the 2, and I've got this 5. For negative numbers, I have 6, 3, and 1. So the total score for the positive team is 7. The total score for the negative team is 10. So the negative team wins by 3 points. The answer is negative 3. So here in this example, we saw all the different sort of pieces. We saw adding positive numbers belongs to the positive team. We also saw that when we sort of subtracted this negative 5, it ended up belonging on the positive team as well. For the negative team, we can count these negative numbers that were being added. And also this minus 6 belonged to the negative team. I could have rewritten this as plus negative 6, but that really wouldn't be necessary. This subtraction rule about changing the sign of what comes after it only applies to whatever that subtraction sign is sort of attached to. So this subtraction sign here is really only attached to the 6 since there's no parentheses. So I didn't have to go down the line and change the sign of everything after this subtraction. For this one, because it's in front of these parentheses, it applies to both of these numbers and it changes the teams of both of these. Okay. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope this was helpful. The next video is going to be a different method of thinking about this same type of problem. So if you didn't like this one so much, maybe the next one will click better with you. Other than that, I hope you're having a great day, and I will talk to you again soon.